Chicago's 19th century rebuilding is usually told as a story of fire, resilience, and engineering audacity. I began there, with maps browned by time, municipal ledgers stamped and restamped, and engineering journals that spoke confidently about sewer expansions, river reversals, and the choreography of reconstruction after catastrophe. Everything on the surface made sense. Streets lifted, channels rerouted, foundations reinforced. It was the language of necessity, of urgency, of a city racing to remake itself before memory hardened into accusation. But threaded through those same documents were quieter references. Corridors below grade, arches sealed rather than dismantled, stone conduits whose dimensions seemed out of scale with the drainage problems they were meant to solve. The phrasing was technical, almost bored, as if the writers assumed whoever read these lines would never bother to ask what had existed there before. I traced those mentions across departments and decades. Surveyors recorded them without speculation. Inspectors measured, sketched, and moved on. Archivists preserved the paperwork, but not the origin stories. What remained were numbers that did not quite belong together. Culverts wide enough to walk through, upright, vaulted passages running beneath blocks that had supposedly been scraped clean and rebuilt from scratch. At first, the pattern felt incidental, a byproduct of hurried reconstruction, a quirk of 19th century over-engineering. Yet the more files I compared, the more consistent the language became. These structures were not described as newly built. They were described as encountered, sealed, redirected, integrated. I focused on one cluster downtown, a handful of references converging beneath streets now choked with traffic and steel. No headlines marked the discovery. No ceremonial surveys followed, just annotations in the margins and revised diagrams. Filed under infrastructure upgrades. Measurements began to stretch, dates blurred, explanations thinned. I closed the folders with the uneasy sense that I had not reached the beginning of Chicago's underground at all, only the point where official curiosity stopped. I kept following the paper trail downward, not physically at first, but through transit schematics, foundation surveys, and flood repair logs filed decades apart by agencies that rarely referenced one another. Each document was ordinary in isolation. Together they formed something else entirely. Bricked-off waterways beneath subway extensions, inverted foundations exposed during elevator shaft drilling, tunnels encountered and rerouted rather than removed. Measurements began to repeat, widths too generous for runoff, vaults tall enough to swallow scaffolding, arches that distributed weight in ways unnecessary for temporary drainage, yet ideal for sustained hydraulic flow. The masonry styles shifted from block to block but shared the same priorities: load, longevity, redundancy. These were not hurried afterthoughts. They were systems. Permits acknowledged their presence without explaining their origin. Diagrams labeled them simply as existing conduits. No construction dates, no contractor names, no debate, just annotations in precise handwriting and arrows showing where concrete plugs had been poured. I cross-referenced neighborhoods that had never shared planners, budgets, or redevelopment schedules. The same shapes appeared anyway: curved ceilings beneath straight streets, channels bending toward river alignments no longer used, stonework cut with tolerances that made later brick repairs look crude by comparison. At first the pattern whispered, then it refused to stop repeating. Flood mitigation reports from one decade aligned with transit dig notes from another. Basement retrofits mirrored riverbank reinforcement projects miles away. Wherever ground was opened, some version of the same buried geometry emerged and was quietly sealed. The language stayed careful, capped, redirected, stabilized, never discovered. I isolated a cluster of closures dated to the early 1870s, each logged within months of major reconstruction initiatives. They appeared coordinated, without ever being described that way. Cost ledgers jumped where masonry was involved. Excavation notes shortened, follow-up diagrams vanished. What lingered were inconsistencies that refused to smooth out. If these passages had been built as emergency works, why did their materials outperform the repairs meant to contain them? If they were recent, why were officials treating them like inherited obstacles instead of civic achievements? The corridors did not behave like improvisations. They behaved like something that had been there first. Flood records were supposed to clarify everything. Instead, they complicated it. Sediment surveys taken after the fire described layers of fill dumped with astonishing speed, streets raised by feet, alleys swallowed, first floors recategorized as basements in revised property ledgers that treated the change as routine. Reconstruction contracts emphasized urgency, volume, efficiency, move earth, stabilize walls, resume commerce. Yet when I laid those documents beside the transit logs and sealing permits from earlier decades, the depths began to line up too neatly. Buried corridors surfaced at the same elevations where street levels had climbed. Vaulted channels intersected foundations that had supposedly been rebuilt from bare soil. It was not random accumulation, it was stratified. Committees, insurers, and reconstruction boards appeared everywhere in the paperwork, their language disciplined and careful. They spoke of mitigation and modernization, of rerouted canals and raised grades, of hydraulic control. What they did not speak about was provenance, no acknowledgement of what those buried systems had been before catastrophe reconfigured the surface. Engineering signatures told a different story. Stonework bonded into new retaining walls, as though planners had discovered something stable and decided to keep it. Arches incorporated rather than removed. Load-bearing elements that suggested integration, not improvisation. River reversals followed lines suspiciously close to existing underground flows. Canals were redirected along corridors that seemed already prepared to carry them. The city was not simply rebuilding, it was adapting. When I mapped burial depths across neighborhoods, they clustered in bands. When I traced rerouted waterways, they curved towards sealed conduits documented years earlier. Geography, chronology, and structure began to converge in ways that reconstruction narratives could not easily flatten. The possibilities settled in quietly. What if those bridges beneath the streets were not products of the disaster at all? What if they were older, not relics created in panic, but systems absorbed into a new city rising over them, waiting for material analysis and architectural comparison to decide whether Chicago's underground had been inherited, rather than invented? The stone itself became impossible to ignore. Inside the buried arches, where access had been granted only for maintenance or emergency inspection, the masonry carried priorities that did not match the urgency of 19th-century flood response. Blocks were cut with uniform precision, joints locked so tightly that later repairs appeared crude by comparison. Mortar samples taken during reinforcement projects showed compositions that resisted moisture far better than the mixtures described in contemporary building manuals. I compared those findings against construction standards printed for Chicago in the decades after the fire. Emergency culverts were supposed to be cheap, fast, disposable if necessary. What lay underground suggested the opposite. These passages had been designed to endure. Laboratory notes surfaced in obscure appendices. Inspectors commented on density ratios without speculating on origin. Engineers recalculated load tolerances, then stopped short of asking why those tolerances were so high in the first place. Reports concluded with phrases like adequate for integration or structurally sound for reuse. Reuse. Tool marks told their own story. Chisel patterns inconsistent with rushed quarrying. Stone faces dressed to accept pressure from above, not simply channel runoff beneath a street. Load-bearing curves echoed canal bridges documented far from the Midwest, in places shaped by hydraulic traditions that predated Chicago entirely. The alignment was unsettling. I traced similar forms across distant cities and older waterways, finding parallels that suggested continuity rather than coincidence. Nothing in the paperwork declared a connection. Nothing denied it either. What troubled me most were the details officials chose not to preserve. Several arches had been filled with concrete rather than stabilized for future access. Side channels disappeared behind retaining walls erected after reconstruction, stabilized neighborhoods. The closure orders clustered in years when budgets relaxed and long-term planning resumed, not during moments of crisis. The timing felt deliberate, though never explained. If these systems had been discovered accidentally during rebuilding, why entomb them once the city had recovered? Why not study them? Why not document them fully? Instead, they were sealed into the fabric of newer foundations, converted from functioning corridors into forgotten cavities beneath streets that carried traffic, unaware of what still supported them from below. The stone had survived floods, fire, and redevelopment. What had not survived was curiosity. That absence pressed harder than any measurement, steering the investigation toward institutional habits, archival silences, and a pattern of quiet decisions that seemed designed less to expose Chicago's underground than to absorb it and move on. Once Chicago's underground refused to stand alone, I widened the frame. River cities became data points. Engineering archives from ports, canal hubs, and inland trade centers revealed similar footnotes buried in otherwise triumphant redevelopment records. Subterranean corridors encountered during bridge upgrades, vaulted channels incorporated into new flood systems, stone conduits labeled simply as legacy structures, then redirected, capped, or absorbed into modern drainage grids without ceremony. Surveyors appeared only through measurements, archivists through catalog numbers, transportation authorities through clipped memoranda authorizing alterations without historical inquiry. None of them spoke to one another in the records, yet their drawings began to rhyme. Arches of near-identical curvature surfaced beneath streets rebuilt after fires hundreds of miles apart. Culverts widened abruptly, at points where rivers once flowed differently. Brick repairs wrapped around older stone skeletons that carried water long before rail lines and asphalt arrived above them. The scale kept expanding. Clusters formed along waterways tied to 19th century commerce and reconstruction booms. Wherever cities lifted streets or rerouted rivers, something older seemed to be waiting underneath. I avoided the temptation to name it. Instead, I stacked the alignments quietly. Depths, dates, materials. The repetition did the work on its own. Coincidence held for a while. Then it began to feel overworked. I returned to Chicago with the wider pattern in mind and saw details I had missed the first time. Closure orders, lining up with regional redevelopment budgets. Infrastructure plans that quietly retired subterranean routes. Just as surface systems modernized, references to earlier channels vanishing from updated maps in the same decade, concrete plugs appeared in their place. What had once seemed municipal now looked systemic. Urban planners reclassified old waterways as hazards, obsolete drains, construction obstacles, not as heritage, not as prototypes, not as relics worth understanding. They were treated as inconveniences to be neutralized, while cities reinvented themselves above ground. Across continents, the language barely changed, stabilized, redirected, decommissioned. Official narratives remained confident, linear, complete. Fire led to rebuilding. Flood led to innovation. Industry replaced antiquated systems. Yet beneath those stories, the material record kept whispering the same contradiction. The buried passages were not isolated improvisations. They were widespread. They were structurally consistent, and they disappeared from documentation at precisely the moment modern urban systems declared themselves new. Archives have a way of flattening drama. Ink dries, signatures blur, decisions that once moved tons of earth collapse into lines of text. I went back into those rooms where redevelopment history was kept orderly and inert, following memoranda that authorized emergency sealing projects after floods and fires. Budget sheets tracked expenditures for masonry, plugs, and redirected flow channels. Meeting minutes summarized votes in language that prized efficiency over curiosity. Everything read as procedural. That was the problem. As reconstruction accelerated on the surface, administrative activity beneath it spiked in parallel. Sealing orders multiplied. Appropriations grew sharper, then abruptly ended. References to subterranean corridors terminated mid-decade without technical closure, as though whatever questions had once existed were no longer worth writing down. Departments appeared only as acronyms and letterheads. No individuals, no dissenters, no advocates for preservation. The bureaucracy functioned as a single organism, absorbing irregularities into categories labeled hazard mitigation or obsolete infrastructure. Phrasing did much of the work. Urgent remediation, stabilization required, future access unnecessary. No explanation followed those conclusions. No engineering rationale was appended. Provenance vanished behind verbs that implied inevitability. I overlaid the administrative trail with the locations of the buried arches. The match was exact enough to feel intentional. Each cluster of sealed corridors corresponded to a burst of paperwork. Each budget line preceded a disappearance from updated schematics. The more stone was entombed, the quieter the records became. Silence accumulated the way sediment does. In earlier decades, inspectors had measured and drawn what they encountered. Later, they simply erased it. Maps were revised, cross-sections simplified, legacy systems flattened into dotted lines, then removed entirely. What remained were gaps. Those gaps repeated across neighborhoods rebuilt after catastrophe, across decades of redevelopment that trained themselves as modernizing triumphs, across agencies that never acknowledged one another's involvement, yet followed the same procedural rhythm. The pattern refused to scatter. Intent did not need to be stated for its effects to propagate. Omission could be systemic. Inertia could accomplish what decree never announced. What troubled me was not the existence of sealed tunnels. It was how quickly they stopped being discussed, how rapidly the administrative memory shortened, how efficiently subterranean complexity was converted into footnotes, then into nothing at all. Silence, once traced carefully enough, began to behave like data, and the longer I followed it, the more it pointed back toward the buried bridge network, as something officials chose to absorb into the city rather than expose, leaving urban history shaped as much by what was no longer written as by what had survived on the page. By that point, the accumulation of material had become difficult to treat as coincidence without at least testing an alternative framework. I began assembling what engineers would call a working model rather than a conclusion. Not a story about origins, not a declaration of lost civilizations, but a provisional structure for thinking about what the evidence was already implying. The buried arches, the sealed conduits, the oversized culverts, the sediment layers above finished masonry, the abrupt administrative closures. Taken individually, each could be dismissed as the residue of improvisation. Taken together, they behaved like parts of an integrated hydraulic system that had been adapted rather than invented during man. 19th century reconstruction. I traced gradients, load paths, water flow geometry, the spacing between junction chambers, the curvature of channels beneath river-adjacent districts. Those forms did not read like emergency works. They read like infrastructure that had once carried sustained volumes under stable conditions, later truncated, rerouted, or isolated as surface plans changed. Operators remained abstract, planners without names, builders inferred through the discipline embedded in stone rather than through signatures in ledgers. Whoever had shaped those corridors understood hydraulic distribution. Whoever later sealed them understood the risk of leaving them accessible. The conflict widened from local paperwork to continental chronology. When I compared Chicago's subterranean alignments with buried canals documented elsewhere, similar ratios appeared: span to channel width, fault thickness to sediment load, junction spacing in river cities that had never coordinated their 19th century rebuilding campaigns. The geometry traveled even when the records did not. I kept the model deliberately fragile. It allowed for revision, for dismantling, for the possibility that some links would fail under closer measurement. But it insisted on one thing. The engineering questions were no longer peripheral, they were central. Why had so many of these corridors already existed when reconstruction crews encountered them? Why had sealing, rather than excavation or preservation, become the default response once surface grids stabilized? Why did closure orders arrive only after budgets normalized and civic urgency faded? The framework did not resolve those questions. It sharpened them. Curiosity had been replaced by something colder, a recognition that the built environment was contradicting the timeline attached to it, that systems beneath multiple cities obeyed logics no official narrative bothered to trace. I noted the limits of the hypothesis in the margins, gaps in data, sites still unexamined, materials awaiting laboratory comparison, but the pattern had crossed the threshold where ignoring it felt less disciplined than pursuing it. What came next would not be speculation. It would be motive. It would be erasure, and whether the record had been rewritten deliberately, gradually, or simply allowed to decay once its usefulness expired. Those questions waited ahead, unresolved, tightening the investigation without yet demanding certainty. The model held in suspension until further cities, further surveys, and further buried corridors either reinforced it or tore it apart. By then, the buried systems had stopped feeling like anomalies and begun to resemble absences that had been engineered into the record. I turned back toward the flood narratives themselves, rereading official summaries that framed catastrophe as rupture rather than encounter. Water surged, streets collapsed, crews rebuilt. The arc repeated across decades with mechanical regularity. Yet the documents rarely lingered on what reconstruction workers found before they poured new fill or capped underground flows. The subterranean layer existed only as an inconvenience to be neutralized. After hundreds of pages of reports, a pattern emerged that was harder to quantify than masonry thickness or arch curvature. It was what no longer appeared. Whole conduits vanished between editions of municipal plans. Baseline surveys quietly simplified. Later textbooks condensed reconstruction into triumphal abstraction, removing references to pre-existing channels that earlier engineers had drawn in meticulous cross-section. The absence propagated forward, copied and recopied until omission hardened into orthodoxy. Departments dissolved into language, committees authorized, boards approved, agencies coordinated. Responsibility became grammatical rather than human, distributed across verbs that implied consensus without authorship. The longer I tracked the edits, the more deliberate they felt in sequence, if not in declaration. Why were certain systems described carefully in early filings and not at all a generation later? Why did sealing orders appear without follow-up evaluations? Why did redevelopment manuals teach planners to treat buried stoneworks as disposable hazards rather than historical assets? The questions arrived only after the evidence had done its work. They did not accuse, they lingered. Chicago began to read less like an isolated curiosity and more like a laboratory for a process that could scale outward. If such emissions could stabilize here, under one of the most intensively documented rebuildings in North America, what else had been normalized elsewhere through repetition rather than decree? Memory and infrastructure no longer aligned. One preserved only what the other permitted. What unsettled me was not that decisions had been made after disaster. It was that those decisions had left so little trace of debate, so little residue of uncertainty, so few indications that alternatives had ever been considered. The city above continued to grow confident. The systems below remained sealed, and between them stretched a silence that no longer looked accidental, echoing outward toward questions that exceeded municipal history, and pressed instead toward how entire generations inherit landscapes without inheriting the explanations that shaped them, leaving buried technologies and lost networks folded quietly into the foundations of modern life, while the record insists nothing unusual ever lay there at all. By the time Chicago receded into the background, it no longer felt like a case study. It felt like a coordinate. I began widening the map. not geographically at first, but methodologically. River cities that rebuilt in the 19th century. Port towns that raised their streets after floods. Industrial hubs that rewrote their foundations following fire, subsidence, or disease. Each had left behind layers of administrative confidence above and sealed hydraulics below. The documents differed in tone but not in shape. Sealing orders clustered around the same decades. Budget justifications favored urgency over origin. Engineering diagrams simplified across revisions. Stone channels that once carried labels dissolved into generic drains. Arched corridors became footnotes, then hazards, then blank space. Institutions surfaced everywhere in the same way. Transit authorities, harbor boards, river commissions, municipal works departments. Their identities blurred into interchangeable custodians of inherited systems they did not claim to have designed. What replaced them were absences. In city after city, buried vaults appeared beneath later embankments. Culverts ran beneath districts that predated official waterworks by half a century. Foundations inverted themselves, ground floors surrendering to sediment, while upper levels assumed the role of origin stories. The architecture repeated even when the archives did not. Span lengths matched across hundreds of miles. Masonry courses aligned in technique. Load-bearing curves followed similar geometries despite supposedly emerging from separate crises in separate jurisdictions. With separate contractors, coincidence could explain one site. It struggled with 20. What unsettled me was not the implication of forgotten builders. It was how consistently the builders were forgotten. Had catastrophe forced rapid adaptation? Had convenience rewritten memory? Had administrative momentum smoothed anomalies into irrelevance? Or had something quieter occurred, a slow recalibration of what cities chose to remember once their buried systems stopped being useful? The evidence refused to speak in verbs. It accumulated in silhouettes. Chicago returned to focus, not as a mystery but as a node. One point in a submerged lattice whose scale now exceeded any municipal boundary. The farther the pattern spread, the harder it became to treat silence as neutral. Rivers curved, streets lifted, stone endured, and across an entire continent, the record kept flattening the same depth into forgetfulness, even as the structures themselves continued to shoulder the weight of modern civilization from below. The questions multiplied faster than the paperwork, and none of the answers were written where they should have been. The investigation did not end with a revelation. It ended with depth. I returned again to Chicago, not to uncover something new, but to reread what was already there. Sealed arches beneath rebuilt streets, stone culverts folded into later grids, bridge-like spans buried under fill and renamed drainage, flood reports that treated discovery as nuisance rather than anomaly. Memoranda that authorized closure without curiosity. Textbooks that compressed reconstruction into inevitability. None of it contradicted itself. That was the problem. Across decades of redevelopment, the same pattern persisted. Systems that appeared complete, materials that endured beyond their stated purpose, channels that predated the networks, credited with replacing them. And above all, silence. Silence where engineering debates should have lived. Silence where provenance should have mattered. Silence that traveled forward in print, generation after generation, until the buried became ordinary. Institutions remained present only as grammar. Committees, departments, boards, authorities, the vocabulary of stewardship without authorship. What knowledge vanished when those systems were capped? What operational memory dissolved when arches were filled instead of studied? What assumptions hardened simply because nothing in the record invited reconsideration? I resisted conclusions. The evidence did not permit them. It permitted unease. What remained was not a story of discovery, but of inheritance. Cities resting on infrastructures whose origins had blurred into utility. Networks absorbed into the earth and into language at the same time. Questions displaced by redevelopment schedules and budget lines until curiosity itself became impractical. The buried corridor still existed. The paperwork insisted they did not matter. Between those two facts stretched a space large enough for doubt to settle permanently. The investigation stopped not because the pattern ended, but because the archive did, and beyond that edge lay only continuation. Other cities, other rivers, other foundations built over systems no longer discussed, other silences waiting for someone patient enough to treat absence as data rather than inconvenience. The unanswered debts remained, not as proof, as invitation.